It is now 5 p.m. on Monday, April the 4th, 2022. And I call to order the policy committee meeting for the Belton ISD School Board of Trustees. Got a couple of things I need to read here, so we have a couple of public comments scheduled here. In accordance with district policy, BED local, any person wishing to address the board committee during public comments must submit a public comments form. I have two of them. Since committee meetings are special meetings of the board, public comments shall be limited to items on the agenda. It looks like both of these indicate that they are going to speak on item number 3C. In order to comply with the Texas Open Meetings Act, the committee may not respond to comments or otherwise discuss or act upon any issues that are not posted on the meeting agenda. Each participant shall be limited to 3 minutes in accordance with the board's operating procedures. Speaking to committee members in a disrespectful or threatening tone is unprofessional and counterproductive to a cause. We have a timer on the screen that shows you a lot of time, and a sound will occur at the conclusion. The first person to speak is Janet Brown. Ms. Brown, come on up. You've done this several times, so you know the process.
Yeah, and I think that's what I wanted, that it was item 3, but it's not the 87 thing.
Yeah,
It's a tax review.
would you put TASI policy review?
And the,
You put 3.
and the one up the top of it.
So 3A and B?
So
Yes.
3A and B? All right.
Yeah.
As long as it's on the agenda.
Okay.
So just state your name and for the record, and then
Okay.
you may proceed.
Janet Brown. I've always been an avid book reader and love libraries. There is nothing like feeling the texture of pages between the fingers as the story idea spurs the imagination. What isn't part of my idea of a good read, especially for children, are books filled with descriptions of sexual or obscene, pervasively vulgar, pornographic scenes. To reiterate, these are children. Minors having access to this reading material in a school library. After lengthy meetings and correspondence, I would like to applaud and thank Dr. Deanna Lovesmith for bringing solutions to better improve this book policy for the board to act on. After many emails and public comments, we question why this topic of book review and removal process has not been a more urgent action for any board member to bring forth. During this overview conversation, what is being actively done by the school board and administration to remove age inappropriate and pervasively vulgar, sexually explicit reading material from school libraries? How long will the young children in your care have easy access to this type of material that is dangerous and serves no educational value? Governor Abbott said that students should not have access to pervasively vulgar or pornographic materials in school. Why does our district and board not strongly agree or stand with parents on this issue? No, school boards are not banning books as the media likes to portray. Putting age-appropriate limits, and you have a copy of the suggestion for that, on what is available to kids in schools shouldn't be controversial. And the district's review process should be perceived as a common sense response to their community's concern. Mike Murad, Commissioner of Education, Texas Education Agency, on March 11th said, so the ultimate decision for the instructional material exposed to students in the classrooms or the library materials that are purchased, those materials that are purchased, those are ultimately the review decisions of the school board. They make the decision as to the standards and procedures that are adopted in their local context and in their local communities. So again, a big thank you to admin for stepping up to help our BISD school board perform their function ethically and morally better on behalf of our Big Red community values. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Ms. Howard, come on.
I'm the only other one, so.
Yeah.
Okay, Brenda Howard, Belton, Texas. And I'm speaking to agenda item 3C. When I saw the slides for the legislative update, I was so excited because I saw the words 87th legislative session, which is Senate Bill 3. And Senate Bill 3 covers critical race theory and it removes it from the schools. And it affects everything from curriculum choices to teachers in the class and how they teach. Again, thanks to Deanna Lovesmith for working to removing curriculum that violates SB 3. As it turns out though, if you go below, it says 86th legislative session, which isn't 2022, but it's 2020. It's actually talking about HB3, which is a whole different ballgame. As far as HB3, the only part that I'm really concerned with is the assessment and accountability. Eliminate the punitive A through F letter grade rating system and allow for development of community-based accountability systems. At first I thought we were taking A through F away from students. And then I was like, whoa, that wasn't punitive when I was a kid. But it is the school that gets graded with the A through F. I know people look for that, and that's how they move to Belton because they're looking for that score. So I do hope we don't opt out of that A through F system. I know that they say that underserved populations and poverty populations cause you to have a lower score, but there are some poverty-stricken schools that have 80s, and I know that Belton ISD can do that as well. And then lastly, at the bottom of the slide, it says HB3 will preserve the district's freedom to choose instructional materials, curriculum, and resources that best meet the needs of the local community. That means the board really can ask for curriculum that fits with the values of our community and not the values of the companies that create it. And Deanna is awesome and is working towards that right now. So thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. No additional public comments. We'll move down to item 3. Matt, we're just gonna go in order.
For right now, yeah.
Okay. So 3A, and we do have council with us today. Ms. Wardell, council is here with us, and ma'am, if there's something that comes up that you think we might be hinging on some sort of privilege matter or we need to go into executive session, some of this material is a bit sensitive. Would you kind of wave us down?
Yes, sir.
Can you do that?
Yes.
We don't want to get into that situation. Okay? Thank you, ma'am. All right.
So Mr. Chair, Mr. Floor, and obviously Ms. Lee is absent for this meeting. This is a follow-up to our parents partners discussion that we had in workshop last month. February workshop, I believe it would be now. We are following up on this to make sure that we're continuing to examine what we need to do, what the board wishes we need to do to ensure that we have thoughtful policies and thoughtful approaches to instructional material selections. This policy directly deals with that, and so as we said in our workshop, what we would do is we would have Dr. Lovesmith take a look at policies throughout the state and begin to examine these like we did with EIC local. And so Deanna's here tonight to get us rolling on the examination of different policies to take a look at.
All right, so just like Dr. Smith said, we're gonna start with, we're looking at EF local and just really, my purpose tonight was for us to have a conversation. I'm not bringing forth a revised policy in any way, but to just have some conversation around what should there be any revisions that we want to seek, that we've kind of started to talk through those. Kind of modeled this after our learning study on EIC and had some great conversations along that way. With that, I listed the districts that I've pulled. Now, how do you get on this list? I concentrated on some of the larger districts that I knew might be wrestling with this issue, as well as districts that are known to be strong instructionally. And so we lean towards those. This isn't all encompassing. I certainly could have missed a few. There's over 1,000 districts, so happy to follow up on any districts if you're curious about a specific one. What I will tell you is the majority of districts that I look with have the exact same policy we have. Now, they could be in the process of working on them. So if I knew that for a fact, then I asked them would they mind to share their draft with me once they go through their process as well. But most of them have the same policy. However, there were some different ones, and I included those in the packet, those being Frisco, Katy, and McKinney, and Plano. Not that, just so that I could point out some things that were in those policies that we might look at for discussion. Then the next thing I did was I reached out to TASB. So EF Local is slated to be on their next update. That's not gonna come out till June or July. So they do not have a draft that they could share with us at this time. However, he was willing to, Eric Narcisse was willing to share what they're looking at. And so they're looking at, interestingly, some of the same things I would have proposed. So the first one is a challenged resources exclusion. That's currently, I believe, in Plano's policy. What that does is when you're challenging a resource, it would exclude the ability to challenge a state adopted textbook that went through this Texas approved committee. So if you're aware of instructional materials adoptions, the state does an extensive process. They bring in committee members, they bring in teachers, and they come up with a list of proposed books that are typically it's textbooks. They're also looking at specific resources that are guided by the Texas State Library and Archives Commission. So certainly waiting to see what that final piece will be. I did find the state adoption currently in a district's local policy. Something we could consider as we go through is also, would we want to exclude any adoption that went, or resource that went through a specific process within our own system? So for instance, when we select when we last selected our ELA adoption, our math adoption, we pull in 40 teachers from across the district. It's transparent. We provide opportunity for community to give feedback. So we could wrestle with that. They're doing a basis of inclusion. So this one was a little bigger for me, but right now they're wanting to add the responsibility of the committee to also determine if the resource will continue to be used in the educational program. So right now, I guess the exclusion is based on the principles outlined in the policy, but then they would add to that future decision in return to continuing use.
What section are you looking at right now?
This is not, I haven't gone to that one yet.
I'm
I'll point
sorry,
that
I
out
thought
in a
you
minute.
said Plano.
I did, and I might have given the wrong, on exclusion of resources.
Yeah.
Let me pull that one. So this is, right now, I'm just talking about what TASB's recommending. I thought it was in Plano at the very end where they say, it cannot be, resources, so in Plano on page 2 of 5, resources not subject to reconsideration, instructional resources and their ancillary supplemental materials approved in the selection and adoption process are not subject to reconsideration during the term of the adoption. So if we go through and adopt a math book and we go through a process, and the state, actually TASB is going to recommend similar language. I don't know that they'll use Plano's, but they're going to recommend that in their model policy.
So are you saying TASB or the Commissioner of Education?
So TASB creates has our model policy. And so they are looking to add specific language that you would, a challenged resource would exclude a resource that went through an adoption process that was on the state approved list. So the state.
Which is typically a textbook, it's not like library
It's typical,
materials.
that's correct. That's correct, I'm sorry, thanks for that clarification. But our policy doesn't specifically exclude like a textbook that's on the state adopted list for approval. And so they're looking at adding that just for clarification.
So in other words, if it's already been adopted, then there's no reason to exclude
If the state adopted it. Now, that being said, that's in the challenged resource. We could still work with a parent if there's a section of it that,
Okay.
for some, we not really had that. I mean, if there's a section that a parent opposes to, we always work with a parent on alternative, but
Okay, so
not pulling the resource.
Yes, exactly, that's not excluding it
So
from
if you,
everywhere, right, that's just excluding it in that particular case.
So we're talking, TASB and the Commissioner of Education, they don't always see the eye to eye, right? I mean,
Correct. They don't work together.
they don't work
Correct.
together, okay?
Correct.
So, So the governor, if we're talking about the Commissioner of Education, we're essentially talking about what the governor, what his viewpoints may be, like right now.
So a lot of that rhetoric has been around library books. This
Okay.
specific would
Correct,
be
correct.
around state adopted books. So when we adopt a science book, we're gonna look at biology. The state will go through an extensive process to have, they're doing it right now for some social studies. They collect community members across the state, they collect educators, teachers, parents.
Right.
They go and they identify specific textbooks that are on what they call a state approved list. And so what TASB's looking at is saying if it's gone through that process, we're looking at adding it. And of course, once they add it, it'll be up to our discretion as to whether or not we choose to adopt that. So I'm just kind of letting you know what's coming
Okay.
from TASB.
And instructional resources includes everything, any book you take off the shelf at the library.
Correct.
All right.
An instructional resource that could include from a textbook to a technology software program, a library book. There's all kinds of levels of challenge resources.
And one of the things I think that might be good as we continue to study this policy is to be explicit about what these terms mean in our policy.
Oh, that's great.
Because the more we can be really explicit saying for this instructional resources shall mean and give that definition, that way people know what we're talking about because there's some nuance to that based on current language.
Now, you did say that the Commissioner of Education, that group does review, there's a review process?
There is an
Review process for
extensive review
textbooks.
process for textbooks that are on the instructional materials, like a proclamation list. Now, I will tell you, there are times when like I think about math is a good one. There will be algebra resources, there'll be algebra textbooks, there'll be geometry textbooks, because usually when you adopt math, you adopt, in almost in any area, you typically adopt either middle school through high school, or maybe you're just in high school and they'll name all the different areas. However, there are times where for one reason or another, there might not be a state adopted book. So if it could be an AP calculus class, that might not have a state adopted book. I mean, I don't use that as an exact example because I don't know that, but there are times where, or there'll be literally one book for that. In general, there are multiple books.
So they're not reviewing a lot of books anyway, right?
They review on a proclamation cycle. That cycle originally was designed to be about every 8 years. I will tell you that it is becoming more common that books are extended out in their adoption cycle. So right now, I think we're pushing about 10 years when sometimes the funding's tighter, then they will push out an adoption. And so
Go right to your question on this. This is not a responsive review. TEA, prior to proclamations, says here's a list of approved resources that a school district can adopt. So it's a proactive prior to school districts adopting those resources. That's TEA's role in this. It's not like they get a phone call from Belton ISD superintendent and I say, I need you to review the math textbook that's on this list. That's not a responsive review process. Theirs is they provide school districts a list of state, in Deanna used the phrase state adopted or state approved textbooks that we're able to purchase through, it's called TEMA money, technology and instructional materials allotment.
Is a district bound to go by those recommendations?
And that's where she was talking a little bit, depending on the situation, there are some that are not on that list.
Okay.
you're not bound to go by them, that you are required to go through an extensive process. So we have a streamlined process. We started with our, since I've been in the role, with our ELA adoption, where we have representation from teachers across the system. We have opportunities for parents to provide input on textbooks, so that we can get extensive input.
There could be an instance where, calculus class, you're using a different textbook than what the state recommends.
Could be, we start with the states.
Right.
We always
But
say
that could happen.
That could happen.
it could happen. So we just have to think about in our policy how, if we want to address what would be, could get.
And then your question would be, well, your issue would be whether, if the state says these are the books that we recommend, and we accept that recommendation, then the question is, should those be subject to challenge?
And that's what TASB's going to address.
That's the issue, right?
That's the
Okay,
issue,
all right.
that's the issue.
That's what she's saying, is outlines different in some policies.
Yeah, I just wanna understand what the issue is.
Absolutely, yes, no, I appreciate that, I think just like we did with EIC, there's gonna be some learning along the way so that we're making really good
Right, because we've
decisions.
never, Chris, I don't know if have you ever gone through this process where you're?
I have not,
Yeah.
So what would, right, so we talked about the state approved resources, right, then you also mentioned, potentially including things that went through a larger district process. Like, are there materials that don't go through that process?
Yeah, I mean, there are, you have campuses that'll select the material every now and then to use that could be local, and we'll talk about that when we get to some things I found in
Okay,
the
I'll put
policies.
it in there, okay.
How they just differentiate. There are also things, for instance, right now, a great example is the state has, required that beginning next school year you teach character traits. The state is not going through any process
Gotcha.
for the materials that'll be used for character traits. So what our department's doing right now, the youth counselors, is how could we cultivate our own resources? And how could we make sure that as we cultivate those resources and we write the lessons for our staff, that we have, so we have parent partnerships and we have forward-facing accessibility to parents to see what's in those.
Gotcha.
And so there are gonna be times like that where they will come out with a instructional expectation, but no resources, and so then that the burn's on us with how do we develop that process and what do we use and do we go externally, or right now we're looking at writing them internally, pulling resources, cultivating them. So the TASB in their model, they're also looking at flexibility of committee, so they're gonna just look at the language on the committee selection. We're gonna talk quite a bit about that from other policies, but they just want to, in the informal process, maybe use the language of appropriate administrator rather than specifically stating now that it goes to the principal. So we would have talked about that as well, just identifying, just allowing for flexibility. When you say principal in the policy, it means principal. Could we say appropriate and then determine who that would be based on the review? And then they're also gonna look at some language around formal reconsideration in the committee, just the committee having the responsibility for determining if it's continued for use in the educational program, so just some language on that. Again, I don't have the exact language. And then flexibility on the copies of the report. So I think the policy's pretty specific and just allowing for flexibility on copies of the report, who would be provided to, that type of thing.
I got a question.
Absolutely.
We talk a lot about TASB, right, and someone is gonna author that, this is gonna be a recommendation for our local policy, right?
Mhm.
And someone's gonna author that, is it an individual, is it grouped in, who is it? I'm trying to visualize these people sitting in a room somewhere, trying to figure out what they're gonna recommend to the entire state of Texas.
So I have to admit, that is a fantastic question, and I do not know that. I'm going to look at Holly. Holly, do you know if there's a committee that reviews TASB board policy recommendations? Like, who makes that?
Well, usually it's the policy consultants, based on their experience and working, I know they work as a team, but it is usually the policy consultants, but they consult different groups, when they're developing, but it kind of depends on the policy. Like if it's technology, they might look to a group of technology, school administrators or curriculum, or look to, so I don't know exactly what their process is for every group, but they they do look sometimes to outside.
I'm just wondering, who's in this think tank? That's telling us, because obviously we have some discretion here as to whether we want to change things. So I just want to get an idea of who that is coming from, but.
I don't know, I, like I said, I don't know if it's policy consultants, I know, we all go to one contact, so I don't know if he also brings up, just questions he's been asked throughout the year, because we're all using a model, so we make, or feedback he receives, I don't know the exact process.
So y'all remember Eric, who did our policy review, and Eric is one of many policy consultants across the state.
Right.
And so Eric works in tandem, and he talked a little bit about how they serve various districts throughout the state, so some large, some small, not all in one region, so that they get a wide variety of experiences in a wide variety of districts, and then they come back together. And so usually the recommendations come out of either TASB's policy consultants or TASB's legal services. And then those are served as baseline, so they take that as baseline information for recommended policies in a local policy level, but with the notion that as a local school district, you can adjust its policies.
So the next piece I think are the discussion points that I'd like us to have. The first one is around, so actually, I think it is that challenge resource exclusion piece. And so I told you that what TASB is gonna be proposing, and so thoughts around, excluding state adopted resources, resources that we have, if we go through a state adoption process, then, or, for a textbook, for instance, then considering the exclusion of that. Any thoughts or anything resonate with you on that?
Deanna, can you give us an example of one of them in one of the policies that you reviewed, just how they talk about it, so we can use
Absolutely.
that as a.
So Plano references it as, and I'll be interested to see what the TASB model says. Instructional resources and their supplemental materials approved in the selection and adoption process are not subject to reconsideration during the term of the adoption. So that's how Plano words it. I would tighten, consider tightening that up to be in selection and adoption process of materials on the, in the state, in the, I'd have to use the right thing about the right words, but probably in the state issue proclamation for adoption. So that would really tighten it just to what the state has reviewed and developed committees on, and not outside that. So if we're just adopting something locally, that would be different from a state adopted algebra book, history book, that has gone through a vetted process. So again, we're not making any final decisions, just kind of pondering through that.
Would we wanna have a preference for material on that list? Certainly we don't have to choose from that list, but a preference for material on that list with some sort of additional rigor for something that's not on that list.
Could be.
Good.
I think, so when I think of this, challenge resources and exclusions, the way I think of this, like what ones aren't considered, or what ones shouldn't be considered, but what ones should be considered as well. And so if you look at Plano's policy and the way they do it, so this is at the bottom of 205 for Plano's policy, where it says challenged resources, and then it goes resources subject to not to reconsideration, and then resources subject to reconsideration, and it lists which ones. So to your point, Chris, there are ways in policy where you can articulate some things that, caveats that could be included regarding the policy and the exclusion as well.
I like that concept.
When they mention the selection and adoption process, they're talking about the state process?
These are talking,
They're
so
their own,
this,
right?
this, in my estimation, when I read this, so this would be talking about the regular district process, because it says, and when I look at the bottom of two, instructional resources and their ancillary supplementary resources approved in the selection and adoption process are not subject to reconsideration during the term of the adoption. Why I say it like that is ultimately it is a district's responsibility to adopt those large ones. So we adopt those as a district and use those funds to do that. The way I read this in a local policy, that's exactly what they're saying. But they're saying if we go through a math adoption, we're not gonna listen to or hear multiple reconsiderations of this math book, textbook adoption that we went through a rigorous process to adopt. Now, where I think that could be a challenge is it all depends on how rigorous your process is, how much input you can get in your process, et cetera. But I think what they're saying in this one is,
I mean, the
there's certain
continuity,
ones.
yeah, I mean, the continuity of materials is important, right, for
Absolutely.
lots of reasons, right? Because the teachers are basing their like the detailed day-to-day lessons on that. It's not cheap to go through that process, right? There's lots of reasons why you would wanna keep that constant.
Yeah.
So.
We want to streamline the process too. I mean, just as an example, looking at the situation with the principal, you know, you have, if somebody challenges a book, you know, at the, you know, Belton High School, then somebody else challenges one at Lake Belton High School, then somebody else challenges one at New Tech.
Yeah.
Now you got three principals looking at three different things, which they may look at things differently. So now we're getting different results.
Mhm.
I mean, we have some kind of continuity in the results also. Otherwise, we're just wasting time.
Right, I would not wanna see variation on campus, right? I mean, you're very point.
Well, I mean, but that's how we have it now.
Well, I know, right, but if it's not the right choice for Belton Middle School, why is it the right choice for Lake Belton Middle School,
Right.
right? Like,
So that might be something in the, that we put for district
right,
level. So when we do an adoption for, so I'll give you a good example. When we adopt for a content, ELA, social studies, we do a district adoption. We do not adopt per campus.
Right.
That being said, we are looking at some supplemental resources, and what we are talking about in a new process would be that we do some supplemental resources where there's choices, but there's still district level vetting of those choices, and then a campus could choose, I'd rather use this supplement versus this one based on their needs, but they would have all been vetted. So these are all, we don't, when we do a textbook adoption, we have representation from all campuses. Because everybody's gonna use the
Right.
same, our resources are.
Which to me begs the question, why would we allow, why do we have the principal do it anyway when it's already been through the process?
So our committee and where we run books right now for reconsideration through our process has been on library books, and that's very
Right,
different.
right.
Those are very different.
Which is a whole different.
That's a
ballgame.
whole
Yeah,
different
It's a whole
thing.
different
That's right,
analysis.
that's right.
So when I read this and then you started talking, I thought, we're gonna have to have two policies, one for,
No, I just think this clarifies,
Okay.
because this is not, this challenge exclusion, this is not in any way, it's not touching library books. You're not gonna say, well, because we purchased all these books, they're being excluded. No, this is specifically for books that are gone through a state
right,
process.
right. But the state doesn't review library materials.
Correct.
Right,
That
okay.
is correct. Okay, then the next one, is a little challenging, and this is where I think we'll just, we'll have good conversation, because when it gets to formal reconsideration process, so I broke this up. So this is, now I'm challenging a resource, and so the first piece is committee size and composition. And it was, I was challenged to find, policies, I'm sure some exist, that deviate too much from the TASB model. However, I think that's something that we should discuss. So in our process, we currently use, and we'll have to just, we can discuss whether it's a policy change or then there are just some guidelines that we follow to support the policy. But in our policy, Of course, we do not give a committee size number. We just say, it shall include, one member of the instructional staff who has experience with, the challenge resource. And then other members may include district level staff, library staff, secondary level students, parents, and any other appropriate individuals. That's what we say, so there's not, like, if you think about, well, what's an appropriate size for a committee? We could wrestle with, is it 2 people, the one required, and somebody else, because the word is may? Or is there, an expectation that we have a certain number? I couldn't find any certain numbers in policies. I did talk with some folks that have, an expectation that it's at least, 4 or 5 members. We'd need to think through that. I will tell you, Katie, ISD is the only one where I could find anything, and they address it and say must have an uneven number of representatives. I guess that's so when they're coming to a
Which makes
final
sense.
consensus, there's an uneven number. I think, we could look at, the use of the word may. And do we wanna move any specific, expectations over? The other piece of that, and then I think I'll pause and talk, is that there are folks that, I'll wait for appeal, that move committees into campus and district level. And I can talk through that I've seen some of that work done in the appeal. So when you think committee, so this is a committee that is determining whether a resource should stay or not stay in a library, and that's a really powerful decision to be made, and so it needs to be thoughtful. Is there anything that resonates with you all in terms of committee?
Did you just say library though? Right, because we're not talking about library though, are we?
This would, for a formal reconsideration process, that could be for a
So it
library.
would look the same for library resources.
So once
and
we say
instructional.
you can challenge a resource,
Mhm.
whatever that
And
resource
resource
is.
is a resource is a
And a
resource.
resource is a resource, then it goes to a committee. And so right now, our policy states that it's one member who has experience using that resource with students or is familiar with the content of it. And then it says may include district staff, library staff, secondary level students, parents, other appropriate individuals.
My concern is just inconsistent results. That's the one thing that really concerns me, is having, Belton Middle School have one result and then have another middle school with South Belton have a different result, and then North Belton have a different result.
So that's a great so let me share some thoughts on that. So when we have a process, we could pull, and we can decide, does the process pull from only one, from the campus where that resource is initiated, or does it pull from systems district-wide? So there's kind of a lottery pull. So if a book is only located at South Belton Middle School, then typically we pull folks from that campus. However, that committee's decision is gonna hold true for the entire district.
Right.
So if that book is at North Belton Middle, Belton High School, it doesn't matter where that book's gonna be pulled for the district. It's not pulled for a single committee. And it would be pulled, and we'll talk about that when we get to frequency of review and how long it's pulled, it'd be pulled indefinitely, so it would kind of go on a do not order
Which
list.
Frisco addresses in theirs.
They do. And so, so thinking about that committee, would we wanna have, representation from like level schools? So if it's a book at, again, at South Belton Middle School, but that book is potentially going to be pulled from every middle school and other high schools, then is it important to get cross-district voice from committee members.
What if you have a book challenge at the exact same time? Who hears it first?
So right now, it's one committee.
One
So
committee,
if
right.
two,
So
if
it's
two parents
it's
were at
essentially
two different
located.
schools and they both hit send on, I want to pull this resource, we have one committee that reviews that resource. And then that decision is made for all campuses.
I'm talking about the process we have where you have a principal involved. Where the principal is that informal situation. And then it goes to the formal process.
So, and here's the way I think of that is that if I have a parent that comes and has a complaint, let's say, let's take junior level English class, maybe somebody's reading the Crucible, and the parent has a complaint about a novel that's being read in the class. The initial way you usually go about that is a discussion with classroom teacher and then appropriate campus administrator. Because there could be other items that they could substitute for that student and that parent.
That's the informal
That's
process.
the
That's the
informal.
informal process.
And that's what the way I would propose we start to craft future language and policy. The way I think what has happened with us is a growing school district.
Right.
Our policy is a little outdated in the mindset that it's a one high school, just a couple of middle schools.
At multiple campuses.
Right. And so I think we probably need to clarify the difference between informal campus-based reconsideration and a formal reconsideration process. The other item that in hearing this conversation that I think we probably need to clarify more is the notion of primary resources versus supplemental resources too. There's a difference between a math textbook being used in a classroom that every student in the district is using versus a library book, like the example that you've created. And I think we've got to clarify some of those terms and figure out how to clearly articulate what the process would be for each one of those things. Because one of the other items that I note, I think Deanna, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know this, but when it says challenged resources exclusion, I think one of the things that is gonna have to be discussed too is if a book is challenged, let's say the library book is challenged, for example, does that book remain on the library for people to check out during that process, or does it not? Or classroom book, maybe it's a textbook or whatever the case might be, do those items continue to be used in the system during a challenge process? Is that what that term means? When I see challenged resources.
That was, no, although I think you're correct in that we do need to wrestle with that piece. That actual piece was in reference to going back to that initial TASB addressing as well of, can I challenge a resource that the state adopted and approved and went through their process?
Right.
And being clear on that.
So there's some things that would be off the table for being challenged in that.
If we chose to move down that pathway. Just so that's providing clarity, but to your point, yes, I do think, as we also need to address in the challenge process, what happens with the book and where does it go? Is it pulled until a decision is made? Is it stay in circulation right now, and what do we wanna do with that? So on committee size and composition, again, going back to your thoughts on that, I mean, in your mind, is there I don't wanna lock us into any number per policy, but we might need to think through, no less than 5 people will serve, or 4, you're pulling a resource,
And each one has a vote.
and each one has a vote.
I mean, I'd almost rather start with who are the right people to be involved in the process and not start with a number, but who are the right
Absolutely.
people, right? And so, having the conversation around, if it's gonna be a district-wide impact, then it shouldn't just be one campus, right? Like, we need to have representation from the same level and, at least another campus, or, where, somebody from curriculum instruction, somebody from, the parent in the district, is one enough? I don't know, maybe we need more, but like, what are the categories of people that should be providing feedback to say we to say we've given this thing a real shot.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So it might be just articulating the groups that would be involved,
Right.
that we need to have involved, not necessarily the number.
Right.
And maybe given the nature of the resource that's being challenged, it might be a bigger group or it might be a smaller group.
Right.
Just, you might have to include, example, parent, staff member,
Yeah.
et cetera. Okay.
Matt, going back to your example about the novel in the English class, I mean, if you had that same novel that like Belton had in Belton High School, and then two people challenged it, two parents challenged it, but one of them, the English teacher at Lake Belton said, no, that's what we're gonna have. And the one at Belton High School said, no, you're right, let's do something different. I mean, you're still having an inconsistent result.
Here's what I would say on that is, though, I think that in working with parents, there's always been, and I was a high school English teacher, this has been going on a long time.
Sure.
If there are families that have concerns about a book that is being read, you obviously want to work with that family. We don't teach necessarily the content of the book, you teach the ELA standards that we have for the state of Texas. So you're talking like things about author's purpose, or you're talking about things like foreshadowing and characterization, and et cetera. So there are multiple resources that could be used in that discussion. I think what we would want to do is create opportunities to make sure that there's some flexibility there. And I think honestly, that's what teachers have done for decades in this area. I can think of specific ones as both a teacher and administrator thinking through how you work with those concerns. And I think you always want to work with the concerns. But I think that's probably why the statement is in many of these where I see guiding principles and it says a parent's ability to exercise control over reading, listening, or viewing matters extends only to his or her own child. And so I think, in the spirit of what they were putting in that policy, it's really about, do I want my son or daughter to read this or participate in this? And they can work through the local teacher and principal to do that. And what we're talking about is when the questions boil up over and over, or when there's someone that says, this resource shouldn't be used at all, that's when this district level committee should form.
And I also want to bring up, like, there are informal processes that already happen before it even gets to a principal. So, as I shared with you all in meeting with the librarians, I mean, there are parents now that will say, I really don't want my kid to read, Dogman or Junie B. Jones or whatever, and a parent will flag that account. They're not asking that no one read it. They're just saying, I really don't want that for my child, and we want to keep that partnership.
Deanna, when we went through the EIC exercise, I mean, I think, and one of the things that I remember thinking about when we were doing that, I'm thinking about when I read this in preparation for today, is that if I'm a parent or just a member of the community and I want to challenge a resource, I want to be able to read the policy and say, okay, this is how I challenge it. This is what I need to do. And if I lose at that point, if I don't get what I want at that point, ultimately, where does it end? So I think, if those questions are answered in this policy, because you read our policy, it kind of works for a one-horse town. We're not that anymore, right? So now we have multiple campuses. I think ultimately, if we can craft something that answers those questions, I think we've met the challenge.
I think where this does get really sticky is a question that you asked we haven't gotten to yet, right? Is what happens to materials in a challenge? Right, so there may be some things that get challenged and really shouldn't be there. But there may be some things that get challenged, I don't wanna say frivolously, but like they get challenged and it's maybe not a valid challenge, right? And so, but you can't make that determination right off, right? It needs to go through the process. And so in one case, it might make sense to pull the book, and in the other case, it might not, right? So it gets really sticky. I don't know, I gotta spend some cycles on that, I think.
Holly, do you have any thoughts on that? Any perspective on that?
I think districts do everything on the continuum with respect to that. Some, they get a list of books and they pulled everything. And I believe there's some legal authority out there on that issue, so I was making a note, I'm gonna go back and look at that.
Sounds good.
I mean, somebody with malicious intent puts in a request against every single book in the library, and all of a sudden you shut the library down. Like, that's an extreme case, right? And I would like to think we don't get there, but it could happen, right? We're not gonna pull every book out of the library.
And I think that this is where it creates challenge, I think, in this topic, and I think it has for decades as well, is that the perspective of a community that serves 13,400 students and families of subsequent students, you can have various perspectives in all of that.
Right.
We do have various perspectives, I
No,
shouldn't
no,
say you
absolutely.
can, we do have various perspectives there. We are creating systems and policies that represent every one of them. And so I think the challenge in that is trying to make sure when we go through the process that it's fair to all involved. And there might need to be, in some cases, discretion applied to that topic as well. And I don't know what policies look like that allow some of that discretion, but I think that discretion hasn't been outlined in policy well in the past.
Yeah, unfortunately, discretion is where we get in trouble with.
Absolutely.
What
In a case
happens,
of-
That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Holly, what happens in situations where there's a challenge and there is, just on the surface, there's a distinct legal issue attached to it? I mean, how do you address those kinds of things?
I guess it's gonna depend on the issue.
I mean, and it needs to be recognized sooner than later, right?
Right? Yes, I'm sorry, I'm spinning on something different.
Yeah.
Same thing that you are.
So Emmanuel, in your question, if I'm understanding it right, it's the balance of all of that, when there's legal precedent that could be applying to that.
Right, when there's a significant legal precedent attaches to it. That's something that we should attempt to obviously recognize sooner than later.
Mhm.
And how do we assure ourselves of that?
Mhm.
And I don't know the answer to that question.
Trying to think of some kind of middle ground, right, that doesn't shut an entire building down. Again, that's an extreme case, but, you know, so if somebody challenges the material, does it sort of go to a special library, right, where like kids can still get to it, but you gotta get to it with permission at that point. So you haven't pulled it and it's not, you know, so it's still accessible if somebody really wanted it to be accessible, right, but it's not generally accessible. I don't know if that's something that
Maybe requires a parent permission
Right.
to check out. This is a book that we
Right.
is going through our
So it's still available.
reconsideration process and this, yes.
In one of these policies, the material remains available until the entire process is, if I remember correctly,
That's correct.
until there's a final decision from, I'm assuming, the board.
Let me look into a couple things again. Let's
Okay.
come back to that issue.
All right,
Sounds good.
thank you. Also, so not addressed in policy, but, that I could find, but, in talking with some districts is the selection of a committee. So some districts, develop committees at the beginning of the year and they're just kind of standing committees waiting, should there be a consideration process. That sounds great unless you have multiple committees or multiple, and then you just don't want a committee, one single committee, maybe hearing all of them. Or I talked with the district about, there's a selection, there's kind of a randomization process. So I randomly draw, so if the book is at a specific campus, that principal and a parent from their campus will be on the committee, but then I randomly draw other campuses to have a teacher representative. So that if it's an elementary book, then I might say we were gonna need 3 teachers, and so I'll randomly draw what campuses those 3 come from and then ask. So there's some just wrestling with how do you develop the committee so that it doesn't isn't swayed in any one way or another. How do you collect volunteers from the beginning?
I think you wanna get away from, if I'm in the grieving process and I grieve to, my first option is to go to Dr. Smith. And then if he rules against me, then my next option is to go to Dr. Smith. I mean, that's just silly, okay? that process doesn't work. Okay? It needs to work, and there needs to be some teeth in it from the beginning. And if that person doesn't get the decision that they want, they need to go, and there needs to be some sort of review of that.
So that's the appeal process, and we're gonna talk about that next, cause you're right, and multiple, districts address the, appeals process. But just before we even get to appeal, we, when there's a formal reconsideration and it goes to a committee, there's a committee that needs to be established, and we just said, you know, we can look at the roles for that, but then there's also, how we get multiple representation across the campuses. So it's something we'll be wrestling with, but wanted to bring that forward with you all as well. There's a lot.
It's a lot.
It's just like EIC, I mean, there's a lot in this. So then the next piece you allude to is this appeal process. And so, right now, if our policy states that after it goes through this initial review process, the complaint may be appealed the decision of reconsideration in accordance with the appropriate policies, and it really doesn't say too much more about what that process is. However, when you look at, let me see the best one, I think it was Plano. I apologize, I'm doing the, so here it is. So Plano specifically talks about having a district level appeal. So they run the process through a second committee. So there's the first process or appeal level is that initial committee. If the decision does not meet the request of the person asking for the reconsideration and they wanted the book pulled out, and let's say it wasn't, then it goes to a district level committee, and then that district level committee includes curriculum. So they kind of hold their district level staff for that appeal, that second level process.
And they had deadlines.
And they do have some deadlines, and they taught, so we, I looked, their policy was written in 2017, I think it would have to really address, deadlines, and you have to come up with how many committees can be managing at one time. But again, if you have this process, you know, our goal is to have it solid, and you have this really robust first level committee, then you could identify for that second, do we wanna run it through a second committee? And Plano does that, saw it in a couple others, I think Frisco doesn't really address, I don't think, their appeal process, they just address campus versus district selected, but I do think, thinking about, like you said, that process for appeal, Plano was the one that had it. I mean, I think there were some others in Poland, but Plano was the one that really clearly identified we will have two level committees. Does that make you keep going, or anything you pondering on that?
I mean, there's bits and pieces that I like
Right.
of several of these.
Okay, then frequency of review, so I'll go back to Frisco. So Frisco, so we do not address the frequency of review. I think again, and to provide clarity, how often would you review? They say they will not review more than once per school year. I do not recall, I apologize off the top of my head, I did see another district state that they would review once every 3 years.
When you say not review more than once per year, so if somebody challenges the material, it's gone through the process, decision's been made one way or the other, it cannot be then challenged again after a year.
That's correct. That's correct. So we're not staying in an eternal review. And going back to that appeals for district level committee, it was Plano and McKinney.
Right.
just so you all know, they both addressed a few policies.
Yeah, I mean, I do like that concept, right, because it allows you to go through the formal review process, but then also put some guardrails around just somebody repeatedly doing it over and over again. Because right now, like, don't have any recourse, right, for that.
Or a different person and,
Yeah, same material.
say, well, you just pulled it, and this committee went through this whole process and they pulled the resource, well, I don't like that you pulled it, so I wanna review that resource again, and so I think I do think, we should wrestle with, is once a school year enough? Is that, I mean, so you're every year reviewing potentially a book, or is it every 3 years? You know, but I think that it's just something we wanna wrestle with and clarity.
If our process is good, then it shouldn't be more than once a year. And I like on page 13, you know, where it says, this is Frisco. If multiple objections to the same instructional resource are received by the district, all objections shall be consolidated and a single reconsideration committee appointed.
Right.
Manuel, what page of the policy is that? This is
It's,
one of
It's 3 or 4.
3 or 4.
Thank you.
It's,
Right above library materials at the bottom.
Got it.
And then at the bottom, it talks about frequency review, which I think we should have. I mean, whenever we get to that point.
Right, it's something we should definitely add,
You know, in that frequency of review though, too, you notice that it does give some discretion to administrators in there.
so we might, could extend it out, but then still provide the discretion if it's something timely that's happened that maybe it does need to be reviewed sooner, absolutely. And then, not addressed in any policies right now, or not in ours, it's just like, but I wanted to just talk about is our new collection process. And so, as we identify what's in policy versus what's in a guideline that we review, how do we, you know, we're looking at that, what goes into a new collection, and how do we partner with, a publisher for clearly articulating what are the expectations and values within our community, making sure that if we've had any books that go through the review, the pull list, or if we pulled any books that we have a process that those do not end up in a new ordering, so where a publisher might put them in, we should make sure. And so having a process where we have multiple librarians looking at those materials, and what all are we looking at? And so making sure that, for instance, we're also looking at when we're identifying a new collection, we're looking at our programs of study. So for instance, with new tech, we're adding some programs of study. So we want to make sure that we have programs that support drone unmanned flight. We want to make sure we have resources for our law strand, looking at high interest books for students. So making sure that before, if we were to build a new elementary, how do we gather feedback from our other elementaries on what were the most checked out books, and making sure that we have those books and we have multiple copies of those. What are we finding? So really just internally coming up with a process for having multiple input and thought and resources on what we're choosing for a library.
There was a question you answered for me when you and I were talking one day about just, I guess, library books in general, and I didn't know this, and I think most people that are not in education don't know. When you build a new school, for example, like Belton High School, tell me very quickly what the process is when you bring there may be 4,000 titles that come to that school. I mean, what's the process?
Deanna can tell you.
I'll tell you what that process is. So we work directly with a publisher. There are multiple publishers out there. and we request a new collection, or we're purchasing for a new collection. And so when we do that, we'll tell them they'll ask, how many students do you have? What are the age ranges of the students? What are there any specific requests you have in terms of programming? What's your like a Spanish speaking population? Do you have other languages that are spoken that we need to be cognizant of in terms of purchasing those books? They have a standard collection, and then if there's anything that we absolutely do not want, how do we communicate that to you as well?
And typically have, like, for Lake Belton High School, how many titles were there?
18,000.
18,000. So, I mean, it would be a more than a daunting task to try to go through every one of those to figure out, well, maybe we don't want these 10 titles on here.
Absolutely.
Is that typically what school districts do across the
So,
state?
I think that the climate has changed in the last year or two with what folks are now doing versus what they were doing, to be fully transparent. And so I do feel like you're gonna have now, you can say, hey, if there's books that are typically, they're known, I could pull them before I ever ordered them if I didn't. The publishers can work with you, and I heard the term first use, like a new collection process specialist that specializes in designing what goes into your new collection.
Can a district be forced to purchase certain titles?
No.
No, okay.
It's up to the district, and they'll give us, what's a list of the titles that can be purchased, and then like we can go through and vet it for, do we have enough early readers, because that's another thing they'll look at reading levels so they know, like, based on how many students that you're ordering for, what ranges and like reading levels that you should order, and
Right. So there could be,
issues that.
it's possible to have a title or 2 or 10 or 30 titles that get through that 18,000 that you may not want.
Absolutely.
They just get there.
Absolutely.
And then once they get on the shelf, it's a whole different process of trying to get
This
them off.
process right here,
Right,
and that's what this process is designed for.
right.
So that if there is a discontent with the title that's on the shelf, that it goes through
Goes
this
through this
process.
process, but then this process is not subject to attack legally, right? When I say the process, not necessarily the process that we have in place, but the end result could be challenged legally.
I think absolutely. I think our local policy doesn't prohibit us from being challenged legally.
That's right.
I think one of the things that, could come out of this too, as we study this policy, is the guidance from a policy perspective on selection criteria too, when you're ordering those new library collections as we continue to grow. And as you heard the other day, Bob Templeton saying, 3,100 students in the next 5 years here. As we continue to grow and potentially open new schools, this is a topic that is going to be ongoing. And when I look at, in our current policy, one of the things that it says right in there about pages 104 and 204, they talk about selection criteria. And there's some specific language in there, we might want to be really thoughtful about what is the selection criteria for ordering new books in a brand new library and making sure it reflects what our board would desire it to reflect. Because I do think that after you get stuff on the shelf, it does become a different issue.
It's more difficult to take it off.
Yep.
Legally, and even though if we all supported it, at the end of the day, then someone who wants a book on there that we want to take off could challenge it, could go to the court system and challenge it that way.
That's right.
Whereas if it never got on the shelf to begin with,
It's a different story.
different story. Good work, Deanna. That's
Well,
a good start on things. Obviously, we have a lot of work to do.
We have a lot of conversations.
A lot of work ahead of us.
What we'll do, are there any requests that you have of Deanna
I know.
prior to us coming back again for next discussion on this? Anything that you need in the board?
I mean, I wrote some notes down. I mean, I thought that the policy at the end of the day should have, there needs to be consistency in decisions. You know, we don't want multiple campuses making different decisions. I do like the central body, having a central body make decisions, more so than having it different campuses. I like the idea of deadlines in the system. We don't want somebody having it file an appeal and then they come back 6 months later. There needs to be a deadline in there where, you know, if you get a decision, an adverse decision, you know, you've got 30 days or whatever it may be, whoever's making decisions, whatever they think is probably a good timeline. Because I don't think that we have that in ours. I do like the idea of having finality to things. If a resource is challenged, you know, in 2022, I don't know that it should be challenged in 2024 again, because it's already been through the process. So, and if our process is good, then we need to trust it. We need to trust the process. Those are some of the things that I just came up with after I read this material.
So to make sure I understand, so maybe coming back and talking about, having, the development of a central committee that would represent multiple campus voices, and then, so that it wouldn't be inconsistent from the campus, and then.
And in line with what Chris said, you know, your suggestion about having the right folks on there.
Did anything resonate with you all in terms of an initial committee and then a second appeal review committee? I
think the second body should be obviously a much more narrow body. I mean, if you've got 21 people on the first one, you don't need to have 21 on the next one. It needs to be, I don't know, it's 5.
But you also can't decide anything with 21 people.
Right.
No work gets done with
But
21
if you have
No,
that
I'm just
first
saying there's-
committee,
But it does need to be an odd number.
you like odd number?
I like odd
Okay, or
numbers, yeah.
an uneven number. Okay. Chris, anything?
Brian, I mean, I think you hit on it, or Dr. Smith, you hit it on, right? I mean, special emphasis on the upfront selection criteria, right? I think we need to put that there. And then certainly, we gotta figure out what happens in a case where something is challenged. Right, 'cause
In the case of what?
in the case where a material is challenged, what do you do with it while it's being challenged?
Oh, right.
Right, but, you know, again, the principle is have a well-defined process that somebody knows, can have a reasonable expectation of, you know, if they go read it, that's what's gonna happen. You know, have a process, follow the process, have an appeal for the process, and then, once it's done, right? If we can define all that, that's what it needs to look like.
On page 21, you know, McKinney ISD, they have for the campus level reconsideration committee, that's what they call it. They have a standing campus level reconsideration committee within the first, that's appointed within the first 4 weeks of each school year,
Right.
and then they serve throughout that year. I don't know that maybe you should rotate that, you know, I like the fact that they don't have the same people on there every year, right?
And then also maybe wrestling with how many books could be in review at one time. So if we're having central committees, we gotta think through,
Right.
how do we manage that,
Manage that.
if there's multiple
Yeah,
requests?
what if somebody challenges 200 books?
That
Then,
goes back to what are you doing there?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, and then what do you do in terms of, in the process of determining, or making a decision about the challenge? I mean, if it's 200, you have to read all of them? And obviously that's just not practical, it's not gonna happen. You might be able to do it.
I am a reader. I was like a 200 book reader a year, I'm a reader.
I read
There wasn't really-
26
you didn't
books
have to
last
read
year.
it.
I don't know how many more I could have read, but I too am a reader, but I do have a limit. So
You know,
we'll
we can-
stress with that. So I think
We
that's,
can pick this thing to death though, I mean, but, you know,
So if we brought back to you some samples of policies and ideas that we like around process, about selection criteria, and about guidance during the process, that would be a good starting point for us, and
I
I
think
think
so.
that's the next meeting. And we can pick some things that we, based on our conversation today, we see in these policies or in other examples, bring them back for some discussion and go from there, but I think those topics, that makes sense. to me.
process, selection criteria, and what was the last one that you said?
What do we do with books during the middle of the process and
All
stuff?
right.
Like, just looking
Yes.
through what we see from those, I think would be a good starting point to dive deeper. Those seem to be central pieces for us.
the inclination for me is that, you know, if somebody challenges 50 books, I don't know that you should pull them all, I mean, until the process is done.
I keep coming back to sort of the ability to preserve parent choice
Mhm.
for their kid. Right, and not making a sweeping statement that impacts every kid.
That definitely, resonates with me on this one, and I just think about the example Maynard just gave, out of 50 books, if somebody challenges 50 books, if all of a sudden books that another family is very interested in their student reading, and so
Sure.
they don't have access to that
That's right,
anymore.
that's right.
That is an interesting challenge for us, so it's gotta be, and I think that was the intent of that line, and for most policies about a parent has discretion with their own student, but not about every other student.
But we could also add in there in the policy that during that initial grievance or whatever you wanna call it, that initial review, whether it's informal review, that the parent can say, well, you just take it off my, access to my kid, and then I'm done with this. Then I think a lot of parents would make that choice instead of going through the process. And it would streamline it even more. But we need to have that option available to them.
I think parent choice is consistent with our community beliefs, right? I mean, we wanna make decisions for our kids.
That's right. Excellent. Well, thank you. I appreciate that guidance, and we'll bring back to you next step.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much.
Great job.
I'll move this, I'll move it on, and I'll know that it's working.
Good news, Manuel. We're able to consider the agenda and later today.
We are.
Yes, we are. As you know, we have Dr. Golden here, and Dr. Golden can give us a little bit of TASB policy review next steps. If you remember, that was our meeting last month, is the TASB policy review with our policy consultant.
My update is gonna be very brief. So,
Okay.
as we shared with you, I believe it was in the October-November timeframe, a policy review session offers us a comprehensive review of our policies, and gives us an opportunity to look at district practice as well as, changing law and look for that, alignment and make any changes necessary. The last comprehensive review of our policies was in 2002. So we are to the point in our process where, as you know, in March, an administrative team worked with Eric Narcisse, our TASB representative, as well as the board did the evening, I believe, of March 8th. And have gone through policies. He's in the process of making some recommendations. Sometime, we believe this week, actually, we'll receive what some of those recommendations are. We'll be bringing all of that back to this committee. And then we have options at that point. We'll look at the big picture of what he submits back, and then can, depending on the quantity, can then calendar out which are the ones that we'll bring to you over the next several months and look at and see if we want to accept the recommendations or make any tweaks. And we'll do our first readings and get your input in the policy meetings, and then take whatever recommendations for changes forward to the whole board for a second reading and possible approval.
So we'll be, again, hopefully in May, being able to bring back the total package of feedback and then start looking at those policies over the next couple of months after that.
I didn't think there were that many policies that we had issues with. Was there? It was,
I don't think we're anticipating a whole lot of them, but we're waiting to see this week what we get back.
okay,
It's essentially anything where we had a local version.
right. Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Next on the agenda, Connie, can you pull up our legislative priorities update? So as a reminder, last year our board of trustees adopted these legislative priorities that you see in front of us. And as you can see, that was for the last legislative session. As we continue to grow as a school district and continue to work with our representation from our state level government, we have to revisit our priorities on a semi-regular basis to make sure we're continuing to ensure we're advocating for and also communicating the priorities that are needed for Belton ISD. As a fast-growing school district in an area that is poised for long-term growth, we have some unique items that are unique to our school district that we need to make sure are those making specific statewide policies know and understand, and that we are able to clearly articulate those things. So what you have in front of you were the items that the board adopted last spring, and were the items that we used for consideration as we continue to communicate with our state representatives and our local representatives. Moving forward, we have the ability to continue to refine these and get ahead of these for the next legislative session. And I do know that our board is constantly interested in making sure that the story about ISD is heard and understood, and that we are advocating and also communicating the needs of our school district. So with that, I'll leave it open to you all, and we'll let you talk a little bit about items that you think we might want to consider discussion with the policy committee in more detail, and potentially with future board, whole board meeting as we continue to navigate this. My hope would be is that we're able to land legislative priorities for the next year by June of this year, so we have a couple of months to dive into this topic over policy committee meetings and over regular board meetings.
You know, that first one, sustain and increase flexibility in school finance, I mean, that's a perpetual, that's never gonna go away, right? The more we talk about it, the more I get a little bit of better understanding every time we do that. And especially now that we're in this, you know, it's a bond election coming up. I don't know, talks on that are always good for us to know. I mean, the more that we know, the better that we can serve. That's the way I look at it. Here's what you think.
I mean, that bullet by itself, right, sustain and increase flexibility in school finance, I mean, we are where we are today because of the school finance system, so, you know, I'm not sure that any of us is recrafting the way that the state does this. I'm not sure any of us are smart enough to do that, it's kind of interesting, but, yeah, I mean, that is certainly one of them. I mean, you want me to talk a little bit about the grassroots stuff?
That'd be great.
So Aaron and Suzanne and I went to the Region 12 grassroots meeting, which essentially was like trying to build, you know, sort of the first shot at trying to build the TASB priorities. It was kind of an interesting process. I guess I went to the CASA TASB conference right as the delegate last time. This is the first time going. And so, you know, I got to see the sausage making in the actual meeting, but didn't really participate. We didn't really participate in sort of the lead up to that. And so just how some of that stuff got on the agenda just didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But the three of us going to that meeting, you know, essentially what we got was an overview of, you know, what is the, I'm gonna pull up the flow chart here. What is how is like the advocacy agenda created, right? And sort of the policy components and, you know, so the first step is what we went to a couple weeks ago. And then the next step of it is gonna be actually a larger legislative, committee meeting. And so Aaron and I are gonna go down to Austin on Saturday. And sort of have some expanded discussions on that, before it then gets fed into sort of the larger, cross TASB, priorities, and then ultimately go to the next task of TASB. But what we were presented with the other day was, sort of a laundry list of, over 50 or 60 things on that
Right.
list. And, there was a 100,000-foot overview on like, what is each one of those 50 or 60 things. And then we were asked to basically cast a vote, right? Hey, look, you can vote for your top, I want to say it was like top 5 items from that list, that we could put forward. And I think I've got the results here. Come on, I can't shrink it for some reason. So what came out of that, this will be in order, right? So what came out of that Region 12 meeting was the top priority across everybody that cast votes was health resources for students, followed by reduction of required state testing, followed by sustained funding of school finance system, followed by staff recruitment and retention, followed by support for school facilities. So that was the top 5. The top one, mental health resources for students, right? I mean, that got 10.5% of the votes. So, I mean, none of these are like massively conclusive, at least when I look at the data. I don't know that these were completely aligned with at least the way Aaron and I saw it. Just from chatting back and forth during the meeting, these didn't necessarily align to where we felt. At least, look, all these things are great things, right? But we have the priorities listed a little bit different. And so I'm kind of interested to see how this goes down on Saturday. And kind of, the prior meeting was just, it was during the ice storm, so we couldn't really have a whole lot of conversation. So I would expect there's going to be a little bit more conversation about, what these things actually mean and what happens with these going forward. So we can report back next time, sort of what that conference looks like. But going back to the sheet though, right? I mean, clearly school finance has got to be on there. Clearly accountability has got to be on there, right? And not necessarily eliminating, A through F, but like some of it just doesn't make sense, and some of the consequences for A through F, So, and then clearly the concept of local control is still really important.
Yeah.
And local control, especially in the case of, and things especially where it's local control for high, fast growth school districts, right?
Absolutely.
All need to be on there. Let me see if there are any other things that were on this list that were worth mentioning. Yeah, there was revision of school finance system in general, right? Was one of the things that we looked at. State share of public education funding, right? Because right now, it doesn't matter if our values go up, right? The bucket stays the same. So if we, right, the local taxpayers put more in that bucket, it means the state puts less in that bucket. That's how it works, unfortunately. Let's see, what else did we have in here that we hit? There was some conversation around transparency in charter school operations. There was some conversation on virtual education. Certainly A through F hit it. Natural disaster relief, so around sort of keeping districts whole, around some of the COVID stuff was covered. The concept of the weighted daily attendance, right? Sort of versus total enrollment, right? That was one of the things that came up. I think looking at this, I think those were kind of the higher ones on our list.
Great.
So.
Those are all perpetual topics. I mean, it's.
And really broken.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, but I
Yeah.
mean, it's, we keep talking about them because nothing really ever changes.
Right.
Well, with the passage of House Bill 3, a new city finance formula change, in the state of Texas. Unfortunately, we have been, since the inaction of that, we've been dealing with COVID implications as well. And so I think there's some pieces that we have to pull apart from each other in that to see impacts of HB3, but also separate that from impacts of COVID as well. The notion of a fast growth school district and the unique challenges that are associated with that are the reminder that we get funded on attendance, whereas enrollment, we have to plan for the students that are forecasted to be here and staff for that. And so those challenges are, there are other fast growth school districts in the state of Texas, but obviously not as many that are in the same category as Belton ISD based on our curriculum and our trends. So those two things, I think, are unique things that we need to continue making sure we tell the story right of the challenges that we face in the school district, so our local leaders can hear that.
That attendance and funding issues connection came more to light with this COVID situation.
Absolutely.
More than ever.
Because it's about predictability, right? I mean, how do you create a budget that you can hit predictably? How do you, I don't know how you would do it, right?
Well, let's not forget that there's also state mandated exclusion periods for those testing positive for COVID, which directly impacts your attendance rate, which directly impacts your funding rate. So there's definite things that we need to think about as we're creating these talking points for the next year coming up, because they importantly impact our system. So what I would ask of our policy committee is to review our previous legislative priorities, to really be thinking about the things that are most important for us as a school district to continue communicating well with our elected representatives, to make sure that we're adequately telling the story of Belton ISD and the needs in our state. And then from there, we can have another discussion at the next policy committee meeting and bring a discussion to the whole board similar as we did last year.
I don't know that this needs a massive overhaul. I think there's a couple minor things we can tweak on here.
I would agree. I mean, when we initially created those last year, I know we were still in the midst of a challenging COVID year at the time, but we also tried to create those with some sustainability in mind, because these are big challenges, and it's not like they've gone away overnight.
I mean, the one thing for me that's like notably missing from this is the whole mental health and counseling support.
Yeah.
Right. So.
That was number one, Region 12 in that survey you said, but only 10%, and only garnered 10% of those.
Well, and again, I don't know how they calculated the votes either, right? So I know I got to cast 5
How
votes.
strange is that?
And I don't know, if we were virtual, so I couldn't tell you exactly how many people were there.
Kind of like a virtual hot dotting experience.
Yeah, I got to go to the website and, take my 5 things and
Yeah, and I think, we do have variation in the state of Texas too, even within Region 12 of school district needs. So that can account for a little bit of that, but I do think, again, as I shared when I came in, I was in a listening session in the campus today, and I do think support for students is going to be an ongoing topic to discuss.
Well, Matt, we can ask you the same question. What do you think are the
I think, well, and I'll, I will gladly expound on this in the future, but our finance formula for fast growth school districts needs to be addressed. We need to be able to really think about community-based accountability systems and creating an accountability system that matters to our community, and not always to what is state mandated. In the state of Texas, we have over 1,000 school districts in far-reaching parts of the state that I think one accountability system that meets the need of every one of those I don't think it exists. And so I do support wholeheartedly the notion of being able to set goals, monitor goals, talk about those publicly, report out to our community progress on those goals, and to create a system where we're monitoring that progress in conjunction with our community. And I think that that's a wise thing for us to consider long-term. And I think that ties directly to local control. And I do think that there's some real challenges with
The legislature says that they want local control, but that is not necessarily how they, when they pass these rules, it doesn't necessarily get. Right?
Yeah.
Doesn't mesh with that, but anyway. All right, anything else, Chris? Any other issues for future concern, administrative reports?
Oh, I think we've got a lot coming.
We got a lot.
I think we got a few things to talk about, but this doesn't include all of the things that Dr. Golden
Alright.
is gonna be reporting on our next too, so.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess we stand adjourned.
Thank you.